Good afternoon, everybody. You're probably joining the virtual staff room and you're shocked that Paul Farrell has had an upgrade. Looks a little bit younger. It's not Paul Farrell, it's Steve Hope. So, pretty special for us at Sea Learning today. We are our 300th episode of the virtual staff room. Today, we have a pleasure, an absolute pleasure and a privilege. The majority of people will know this individual, and we've got to know him really, really well, and that's David Price, OBE. David is a best-selling author, a speaker, and a consultant. And his latest book, The Power of Us, is of course best-selling because it's absolutely unbelievable. And it's really invigorated my thinking and that of so many. So let's introduce ourselves. I am Steve Hope. I am quite recently, I think I'm 8th week CEO of Sea Learning, and you might have seen me from the Edgy Futurist. But let me introduce Jamie. Off you go.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I'm Jamie Smith. I'm the Executive Chairman of Sea Learning. Absolutely thrilled to be here this afternoon and part of this special 300th virtual staff room. It's been a remarkable journey that's brought us to this place, and it's so fitting that we've got our very special guest, David, here today. David's work, I know, has influenced so many people who will be watching this either live now or later when the recording is sent out. His first book, Open, which became an immediate bestseller, certainly influenced a hell of a lot of my thinking about how organizations should operate, and his follow-up, The Power of Us, is just an extraordinary read. And I know that that's been a hot topic of conversation amongst so many people in my network. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Definitely. We've wound him up backstage. The clockwork is ready to go, and we're ready to release him in a second. But it is about David. At Sea Learning, we want to collaborate, we want to trust, we want to work with our partners, and not just us in terms of a company, but key people and key players in regards to the future of education and so much more. But as a collective, it's so important to include you as well. And that's anybody that's joining and anybody listening at a later point. We want to drive forward, and we want to showcase the best and the most up-to-date knowledge, research, and articles. And that includes David Price. He's an absolute gent. But we want to hear from you. So at the very end, it's going to be pretty awkward if it's just me and Jamie asking the questions. We've probably asked David about 1 million times over a coffee, or if you've ever been to his house, a lovely broth or a soup. The dog is literally, you can't keep the dog down. So add your comments, make sure you subscribe, and we'll make sure that we go through this afternoon. We pose those questions to David, and he will respond, as he always does, open and honest, and he will bring in the power of us. So without further ado, I'm going to bring David in.
Hello.
How are we doing,
Hi,
mate?
David.
This is not my normal studio. This is a real studio. I'm actually in the offices of a company called Saltwick Media, and the Ethernet's fantastic. So technologically, it's way better than mine. So I just want to thank Saltwick Media for letting me do this from here.
Great. Yeah. Good to see you, David.
And you, Jim.
We didn't even know there was going to be a plug, but yeah, I tell you what, that colour on your wall is exactly the same as I've got in my bedroom. So, power to that studio. So I might have to move upstairs from this little office upstairs because that colour looks so much better than the little plant and the set of I've got. So,
well, you'd expect it. It's a cool media company, you know. Michael Jackson, who runs, is an amazing photographer. I wish I could show you some of the pictures around the wall. They're fantastic.
I set up. Yeah,
Michael Jackson.
Yeah, Michael Jackson's from it.
Yeah, he's called Michael Jackson. I know.
Yeah, I set up my studio to look very much like a kitchen because I wanted to keep it very informal.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully everybody's got a coffee and a cup of tea.
Hang on. Bit of pop trivia for you since you mentioned it. Who wrote "Don't Blame It on the Boogie"?
I'm going to say Michael Jackson, and if it isn't,
it is correct, but it's not that Michael Jackson. It's Michael Jackson from Sheffield.
Is it the Michael Jackson studio that you're in?
I'm in Michael Jackson's studio. Yeah, I never thought about it. I'm not gonna bore you all with me Quincy Jones stories, but there you go.
But I've made it like any other podcast and any other thing that I've ever done. We just ramble and just waffle. I think everybody joining going, when is he going to talk about the power of us? You know what? I think one thing that I've always been inspired by yourself, David, ever since I met you a couple of years ago, is the listening and the real honesty in regards to the voices of the people who are actually doing it and the power of the collective. I know the power of us. That the book is written and driven by you. Apologies if I am speaking and covering slide 3 and 4. But it's basically about the collective and people who are actually doing it rather than just one person. Innovation isn't one person; it's a network and a collective, isn't it? So
absolutely.
Let's get going if you're ready. I will.
Okay.
I'll share your slides. Me and Jamie will drop out. We'll be in the background, and don't forget, everybody, we want your questions, thoughts as David goes through this. There must be loads, and if there isn't, you're not going to be invited back. So that's your challenge. You have to ask questions as we go through. But yeah, let me just bring it in, David, and yeah, we'll remove and give us a shout, mate. All right.
Brilliant. Let me just say by way, it's just over a year, I think, since I did the last thing for C Learning. And, not much has happened in that year, I guess. But we're now about to go on holiday. I can't believe that I'm actually going to try and leave the country. So I was doing some work yesterday in a school down south, and also doing some work with the company that we've been working with. And I'm supposed to be going on a golfing holiday, but I left my golf clubs on the drive back home. So there isn't going to be much of a golf holiday, I suppose. But never mind. I say that by way of prefacing the fact that these slides, they haven't been slung together. Definitely not. But I'm in presenter view, so I can see what's coming up, because I can't remember when I did this. What I can remember is it was just over a year ago when I did the new Never New or Not Normal, or whatever it was. And what was interesting then was, at the time, it was very early on in the pandemic. Nobody really knew how it was going to unfold. I mean, I remember saying to my wife, we were in Australia, we had to come back. And I remember saying to her, it's not going to be so bad, we can go for pub lunches and that kind of thing. And it'll be over in a couple of months. Well, how wrong we were. But we have seen some amazing changes in education, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. So it's picking up on some of the issues that I kind of just raised tentatively at that point, but I think we can be a wee bit more assertive now, not least because, we've had 2 years now without any exams, and the sky didn't fall in. Although I think, in fairness, Department of Education, nothing much has changed there. Incompetence continues to reign. Gavin Williamson's education policy seems to be give it a shot and hope for the best. And it does worry me. I tweeted about it this morning that we're sending kids into schools next week, and it's as if we've just done nothing to try to prevent a big upsurge in COVID. And what I did at the start of the pandemic was to rapidly rewrite the book that we're going to talk about in a moment. And when the book came out, so this would have been August, I did, with the Edufuturists, I did a series of conversations with people, great, inspiring leaders in the book. And one of them was this guy, Gary Ridge. He's the chair and CEO of WD-40, an amazing company. And he had a lot more foresight than I had, because he just said, this isn't over by a long shot. And that was over a year ago. And how right he's proved to be. I caught up with him again last week, and he still thinks we're facing this for another couple of years. So I guess we better get used to it. And that was the thing that I decided that I would do. Like probably everybody else on this call, I thought, well, not going to be doing face-to-face. Yesterday was the first actual face-to-face I've done in, 18 months, nearly 2 years. So like everybody else, I made the switch to virtual. And I don't know about you lot, but it didn't go all that well for me. I'll just play you a little clip of one of the sessions.
Well, the face-to-face training will... sorry, I'm going through the first round. Okay, come on. Focus. Oh, don't start. I haven't even said anything yet. I don't do... What? Because you danced in a photography. I was like... Yeah. Right, let's just close our eyes and reset. Yeah, okay. Take 18. At last. Okay, we'll do one more. Okay. I thought that we're all right. Yeah, I did.
Well, I'm sure everybody's had similar experiences at either talking to your students or recording tutorials or whatever it is. I just get the feeling now that we've had enough of this. So as foolhardy as I think the educational policy's been, I'm delighted that I'm back able to work in a room with people. It's brilliant. And of course, for a lot of people, COVID, this school I was at yesterday, they basically built this beautiful space. It was all Google, Jamboards everywhere, multidisciplinary space. And of course, when COVID hit, everything had to stop. And they basically had kids in rows. It was like going back to a Victorian classroom. So for a lot of people, I think COVID's been seen as an innovation killer. But of course, what I said in the book was that there was a lot of innovation happened because of COVID. You know, not least the timescale. So vaccine development shrunk from 15 years to a year, so much so that, you know, we've got all these anti-vaxxers who think it's just not possible to do it in that time. And kids making, you know, face shields when we couldn't get any PPE. Just this outpouring of innovation, which particularly at the start of the pandemic. And that's really what I was trying to chronicle, because I'd already written the book, and the acid test for me is how have these organizations coped during the pandemic? Because if they were innovative from the bottom up, it seems to me that they would have survived. And thankfully, all of them have. In fact, most of them have had some of the best years ever. So the book came out in August, and it was very well received by the business community. But it's rare that a book, you know, brings any kind of change by itself. And nobody writes non-fiction books to make money, because you can't. But you do hope that you'll change people's minds and just get them to think differently. But I got a lot of people saying, the book's great, love the ideas, but how do you do it? So after about 2 months after the book came out, I talked with a bunch of people, and we formed an agency now called The Power of Us. And we're working with colleges and schools. We're creating a bunch of tools that will help people really create a culture that I describe in the book. So the whole approach of the agency is based around the ideas in the book. Now, I'm well aware that some people watching this will be saying, well, I don't know anything about the book, so this is useless to me. So let me try and give you the book in 5 minutes. I do not want this to be an excuse for you not to go out and buy the book. It's a rollicking good read. The bits with the dinosaurs and the zombie killers is fantastic. So the book basically, in 5 minutes, I suppose, says, essentially picks up where Open left off, where Open was talking about this absolute transformation in the way that we learn because of social media and technology developments. So we started off by sharing what we knew. And then pretty soon we were sharing what we owned through the sharing economy. But I think what COVID has demonstrated is that this phase that the book was about, which I think we've moved into now, it isn't like nascent, it's here, which is that we're sharing what we make. And whether that's 3D face shields or scrub hubs that people did, people are doing this, and they're now doing it at scale. Because of the same kind of technology that I've talked about, it means that everyone, and I'm talking students as well as educators now, everyone is able to share this at scale. And the phrase that sums up, I think, the way that we're all going to be working in the future, it's an ugly phrase, but it's neat. It's called cosmolocalism. So the cosmopolitan part is that we're at the point where we can share these ideas freely around the world instantaneously. And that means that innovation and development doesn't have the things holding it back, like IP. I'm talking now about user innovator groups. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Of course, there are still some dinosaurs, and I put Apple computers in that league. I really do think the future isn't great for Apple unless they start to open up. However, what you saw with the development of the vaccine was the moment the Chinese, albeit somewhat reluctantly, made the genetic code for the vaccine available to everyone, that was when Oxford were able to get straight into it. And they pretty much cracked how to create that virus within a few weeks. So that's the cosmopolitan part. But the localism part is that just like those kids who are making their 3D face shields in schools all over the country, they were pulling down designs for that off the internet, but they're producing it locally because it's more sustainable, and we have to consider all of that now. So I think what we're starting to see are grassroots groups who are sharing that knowledge and producing and making things at scale. And this is a real threat for the other group of people that I call the producers. I'll talk about this in a moment. But it does seem to me that the things that hitherto have stopped user innovators from moving to scale, some of them don't want to because they're just happy serving their own little group, and that's fine. But the thing that stops them from going to scale in the past has always been access to the means of production. Well, you've now got 3D printers for like less than $500, or access to capital. And we've got peer-to-peer lending services now all over the world. So the two things that stop groups from going to scale are no longer appropriate now. And what that means, I think, is that we get into this question of mindset of these groups. And I think this is particularly interesting when you start looking at education. Because if we take people, what I call people-powered innovation, this grassroots sharing of ideas, and developing and making things now, and that could be products or services, then it seems to me that is being driven by this mentality that I call the user innovator mentality. You know, people who are doing it for the love of it, they're doing it for the fun of it. It's not their job most of the time. Many of the time they then become producers, and the mindset changes. I mentioned Apple before. The two Steves used to go to the Homebrew Computing Club in Silicon Valley when it wasn't called Silicon Valley. And they benefited from the wisdom of a group of nerds. And so they were able to change the 20th century by creating the personal computer. Fantastic. The moment that they became producers and they set up Apple, their mindset changed completely. And I think that's when you have difficulties in organizations, and whether that's a school or a college, I don't think it matters. If those two mindsets are rubbing up against one another and not freely working together, then you've got problems. In the book, I talk about what are the things that characterize those mindsets, and you can read the screen, so I'm not going to go through all of this. But it does seem to me that there are very different ways of looking at the world. And I'm not saying one is inherently better than the other. You know, we actually need both. Although I'm celebrating a lot of the spirit of the user innovator communities in the book, you've at the end of the day, you've just got to get stuff done. So that's where the producer mindset works. You know, 5 years ago, I was at death's door, severe septic shock. I was rushed into the operating theater. I didn't want the user innovator mindset. You know, I didn't want the surgeon saying, has anybody got any wacky ideas as to what we do with this guy's colon? Because he appears to be, you know, leaking stuff all over. No, I wanted that producer mindset. And that's when it works really well. Ironically, I'm now working with the NHS because they know that that producer mindset has squeezed out some of that user innovator mindset. And so the things like citizen scientists and the you know, people who are biohackers, all of that is happening in the margins, and the producers need to talk to those kind of groups. So in the book, I talk about, you know, the what I consider to be the key elements in all of this. Mindset, we've already referred to. Operating systems, that's changed enormously outside of education. You know, we've flattened organizations. We've got this thing called holacracy, where there's no managers. That doesn't seem to happen at all in education. The operating systems have pretty much been the same as they've been for 20, 30 years. And also this question of leadership. We're seeing massive changes in the corporate world in this idea of servant leadership. But of course, in education, it's kind of fueled by competition. And it's hard for that more reflective, that more empathetic leadership. But we have to move towards it. And I think if we've learned anything from COVID, it is that. The days of the kind of macho, ego-driven leader, they're numbered. I'm not saying they're gone. We're still going to have some of them, but they're dying out. And of course, it seems to me now that culture lies at the heart of this. The culture of the organization is what makes it innovative, what makes it a positive culture where people enjoy going to work, where students enjoy going to school and college. You know, wouldn't that be great if everybody did that? So what the book is about is saying what are the key elements that go into that culture based upon 3 years worth of research, visited, you know, organizations, but I also visited schools. And I want to focus in on schools. Some of them are more like colleges and not kind of conventional schools. Before I do that, though, I just want to flag up something which I talked about in the book, which are some of the shifts, the trends that were already happening before coronavirus, but I think are going to be even bigger. And one of the things I would urge us all to do is to take on board this crisis of identity that everyone is going through, not just young people, but it's particularly bad for young people, because it's an identity which continues to be defined by the work that we do, the job that we have, even though that's increasingly becoming less and less relevant. So I would love it if people on this call stop asking these 3 questions. You know, when you meet a little kid, the first thing you ask them generally is, what do you want to be when you grow up? You know, well, that's not what matters anymore, because these young kids are going to have to be creating their own jobs. The idea of a job is going to be very different. When we're with university students, we tend to say, you know, what are you majoring in? Well, that kind of narrow specialism, that's no longer appropriate. We saw that during COVID. People have to work across disciplines. And then when you go to dinner parties, you know, you say to somebody, well, what do you do? Well, it's not what you do that matters. It's who you are and what you make. And I think the reason why this is important for us as educators is that it is going to be critical in our young students' lives as they go forward, that they're burdened with as few of these identity crises as possible. Because let's face it, everything else is going to be really hard for them. And this headline from the Times from 2019, you know, that was before the pandemic. So we are seeing this mental health crisis. And a few months ago, my wife and I happened to be in a place that happened to be a graveyard, and we came across a young 14-year-old who was trying to hang herself. It was really upsetting. But what was even more upsetting for us was that when we told our friends about this afterwards, many of whom are educators, a lot of them said, yeah, I've got a similar story to that. So I think this is something that, you know, in the urge to catch up as we go back into the academic year, let's get the mental health and well-being of our students uppermost. So I want to get on to the implications of the book for education, because it wasn't just written for educators. So what does it mean? Bear in mind, as we go through this, and I talk about this in the book, the 2 largest demonstrations that we've ever seen in history were organized by school kids, not adults. And that there's a form of new activism now, which is getting its hands dirty. You can see that right now in London with Extinction Rebellion. They don't care that they're bringing the capital to a halt. They want to see change. They're sick of waiting. But we also see that in Black Lives Matter. We saw it in the Me Too movement. There is a new hyper-connected activism which is going on around the world. Young people particularly, the networks that I'm privy to, they're amazing to see how across countries, across age ranges, these young kids are collaborating. So it makes no sense to me if we class them as user innovators. It makes no sense to be talking about redesigning education on the back of COVID without putting them at the heart of it, without finding out what do they want to see. We're also seeing this notion of communities outperforming bureaucracies. I mean, we saw this all the way through the early days of the pandemic. And we were already starting to see that in pockets around the world. So there's a big teacher-powered schools movement in the US. It also affects colleges, where teachers are starting to take much more responsibility for what goes on in the classroom. They're starting to make hires. They're in charge of their own budgets. Because we know that when you feel like you've got a bit of autonomy, you're going to be more productive and you're going to be a happier worker. As I already mentioned, we've seen these development timescales now slashed. So that's no longer going to be the case in the future. We're no longer going to say, well, it'll take a couple of years before we can get that to market. Why should it? We've proven that we can work at much faster rates. And the users have got to be innovators too. And I don't just mean students in this case. I'm talking about parents. I'm talking about communities. So I think it's not so much a threat, although I do think anybody on this call needs to be aware of the self-help movement in education, things like tutoria in South America, and also the fact that the homeschooling movement saw the pandemic as an opportunity to really get their act together. And they are now much better networked, and they're producing curriculum materials and sharing them around the world. Again, it's that cosmo-localism. But I don't see it as a threat. I see it as an opportunity, because I still believe in the notion of schools and colleges and formal institutions. But we cannot continue the way that we've been going. Not least because there are these social entrepreneurs all around the world, and they I used to think of them as kind of exceptions, but I see so many of them now that they can no longer be classed as that. And one of the wonderful things is that the book has put me in touch with so many of them. So when the book came out, this young woman on the left, she's called Sophia Leal. She lives in Bogota, and you can just see it in the top corner of the picture as a school project. She's 15-year-old. She designed this kind of temporary housing for people who'd lost their home through some kind of natural disaster. And she calls it the Neglu, which is Spanish for new igloo. And it'll house a family of 5 for up to 2 years. Wonderful idea. She's now trying to get it up to production. She's just won a national competition for innovation. And she did that through her school. That rarely happens. Often our young people are doing this in spite of school or college. They've got this other life, which is, it's really impressive. But we have to try to bring that in to our formal institutions, because that way we can recognize what's going on, which takes me to the young man on the right, who I got in touch with. His name's Avi Schiffman. At the time, he was 17. And at the time of the pandemic, he worked 3 days and nights to build a COVID tracking website that would track COVID around the world. 17-year-old, did it in his bedroom. The American government still couldn't get their COVID tracking website together in that time. You all know what happened with Boris Johnson, not even understanding how an app needs to, have either Apple or Google platform to be built on. But this kid did it. And it's now still going. And Anthony Fauci says it's the first point of call when he needs authoritative information. So Avi won the Webby Person of the Year, which for web designers is like the Oscars. And I got in touch with him because he can now. Within like 30 minutes of reading about this kid, I'd sent him an email. He emailed me back. We were starting to have a conversation. And at that point, he told me that he didn't think he was going to be able to get into any college in the US. And I said, why not, Avi? He said, because my grade point average is 1.7. I'm a terrible student. I said, it isn't that your grade point average is the thing. It's the fact that they're not assessing you on the kind of stuff that you're doing. I said, so please take my advice. Don't apply to any college where that's really going to matter. Apply to a college that's going to look at what you've done and recognize the great ingenuity that you've got. And in the end, he got accepted by Harvard. So it all kind of worked out. But it's no thanks to the assessment system, because many colleges would have turned him down. And that's just nuts. So I guess the question is, how do we get innovative learning going on, which is driven by the students? And I think a year ago, I talked about some of these case studies, but it's been fascinating to see what's happened to them in the past year. So just want to bring you up to date with them. The 3 case studies I think I shared were XP School in Doncaster, 3 very different case studies. XP School in Doncaster, New Road School, which is on the right in Santa Monica, highly wealthy area, but they're doing amazing things. And then the school on the bottom left is the Liga Leadership Academy. It's not really a school, it's a senior college. Which takes students from all over Cambodia and essentially builds them into leaders of the future. And all 3 of these schools have got a number of things in common. What's remarkable about New Roads in Santa Monica is that even though it's a private school, you know, what you're looking at now is a photograph of the Steven Spielberg Theatre, because he sent his kids there. I think you too send the kids to this school. But it is unique, I think, in independent schools insofar as it gives away almost half of all the money it brings in, so that it can get a diverse group of students from some of the poorest, impoverished parts of Los Angeles. And I asked, when the book came out, I did an interview with the amazing principal, a guy called Luthern Williams, and I asked him just to describe the kind of philosophy of the school. And I'm going to play you a little clip now. And just bear in mind how some of our posh independent schools, how they kind of sell themselves. This is how New Road sells itself.
Back the socioeconomic, racial, and cultural diversity of Los Angeles. And so they've given away, or the school's given away about $120 million since its founding in order to invest in the diversity that's the foundation for the education.
Which kind of makes it unique, it seems to me. I mean, I know some independent schools give scholarships, but not to the extent that you did. So have you ever encountered any kind of resistance? You're based in Santa Monica. You've got a fairly wealthy clientele who are sending the kids to your school. Did you ever get any kind of resistance of why these kids from Compton also going to the school?
Well, I think that and you've said this before, David, when we've talked, I think New York's built on this idea of inclusion. So we're very clear with our parents about, you know, what the student composition is, and that we think it's essential to providing the most enriching educational environment. And so many of our parents, and some of them are extremely wealthy, and we have some children who, you know, where there's food insecurity or there's home insecurity, and they all mix together. And I think part of what our parents want is they want their children to be prepared not only to go to college if that's the path that they choose, but they want them to be prepared for life. They want them to know how to engage in a meaningful way, in a respectful way with other people. And so in some ways, it's the flip opposite of people's stereotype of Los Angeles, because I think the parents who are generally attracted to us want a more grounded experience for their children that's more reflective of life.
So it's an absolutely amazing school, and it's built around the principles of diversity, about social equity, social justice, and they make no bones about that. They want to see their school as a kind of petri dish for the great experiment, the American experiment, and what it could be. And there's certainly a lot of independent schools, but a lot of government schools and colleges that would shy away from their kids going on marches or organizing petitions and doing that kind of stuff because they see it as a distraction from the education. It isn't. It's a way of feeding it. It's a way of deepening the learning, and it's a way of making it work that matters. So what does that get you? Well, it gets you this.
You've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one.
Quite amazing. When I showed you the Steven Spielberg Theatre, when I first went to New Roads, they were doing a performance of a dance and spoken word poetry piece, which was based on Malala's autobiography. Really highly kind of contentious in some ways, but striking. And one of the kids who read a poem was Amanda Gorman. I didn't know it at the time. She's gone on to do amazing things. But when Amanda Gorman first went to New Road School as a kindergarten student, her mother was, they come from an impoverished family. She make no bones about that. The mother was a teacher, single mother, thought they'd won the lottery by getting her a scholarship. Her and her twin sister got a scholarship to New Roads. She was an elective mute for the first 2 years that she was at New Roads. Can you imagine someone as gifted and talented as she has become, she never spoke for the first 2 years, but then the social activism fired her up. She sees herself not just as a poet, but as a social activist. And she did want to be president. She still does. And for all I know, she still could be. That to me is not a distraction from learning. It's what deepens the learning. Similarly, with the Liger Leadership Academy, that's another school that's got a really clear purpose. Sorry, I keep calling it a school. It's a college. The students are between 16 and 18-year-old when they go there. Very small, 110 students, and they're doing the most amazing work. They are, they've just written the geography textbook, which goes into all of Cambodia schools. They've done the same thing about economics. They work on government initiatives all over the country. And they're doing these remarkable things whilst being taught in English, having not spoken a word of English. These are not, wealthy kids. They come from remote villages in Cambodia. And the school itself, the college itself, is really fascinating because there's a couple of what would be considered mavericks. You're about to meet one of them, Jeff Holt and Dom Sharp from Tassie. And they've kind of broken all the rules when it comes to setting up how you set up a new, what they call the Leadership Academy. They have a particularly interesting view about the role of a teacher in a place like Phnom Penh, where they wanted a world-class education, but clearly they couldn't always get one. So this is Jeff talking about how they solved that dilemma.
A lot of questions about the role of who is a teacher and who is a learner. And we have the opportunity to really explore that idea about, because first of all, if for our school is student-centered, more student-centered, so they get to ask a lot of questions, they get to develop a lot of things, and therefore, and also we sometimes take advantage of opportunities that arise. So the curriculum isn't set. So for a teacher to come in and know all the content to deliver is not what we do. So the idea of who is a teacher and who's a learner is very interesting. So I think we really believe that there's more than 7 billion people in the world, and they could potentially all work with our students. And this is actually very, very doable because of technology. So, for example, we have all kinds of people come in as volunteers for an hour. People come to our school for a month, for a week.
And I think that is really fascinating. I mentioned the NHS earlier, and the woman I'm working with, she's just read my book, and so she read this case study about Liger, and she said, I want to volunteer there. And I said, you should do, because and people on this call, you could volunteer. You don't have to go across to Cambodia. They just want good expertise wherever it is in the world. So the week I visited, kids were having a Skype conversation with 2 NASA scientists. Why? Because they decided it would be cool to launch Cambodia's first ever satellite. They had no idea how to do a satellite. Neither did any of the staff, but they didn't need to, because here was these 2 guys. And this was 2.5 years ago. They still haven't launched it, because then they realized, oh God, we've got to raise some money. This stuff's expensive. So they're doing a Kickstarter campaign. Just to keep it in perspective, in case anybody's going, what, a satellite? There's a project that NASA are running called CubeSat, where it's about so big. These cubes get put into a NASA payload, and then they go off and launch them. But it's really cool. And so what Liger do is they look at what would be really great work, what would be great experience for our students to have, and we will backfill the curriculum to support that. That's not the only way to go about doing this kind of more meaningful work, because the last school I want to share with you is XP. They do it the other way around. They say, kids from Doncaster, they've got to get through their exams. Let's look at what the curriculum is, but let's turn it into something that's really interesting. And in the past 2 years, they've done all kinds of really fascinating, they call them expeditions, whilst still getting amazing GCSE and A-level results. And I was listening to a program this morning about what we're doing to make Afghans arriving in this country feel welcome. And I just thought, well, I know who'll be all over this. It'll be XP, because as you can see, they changed their motto. to, above all, compassion. And I think that's just a wonderful way to describe your school. And one of the really compassionate things that they did, which had really deep learning in it, was to create a video. This is, I think, about a year ago, which would bust some of the myths around refugees coming to Doncaster. Because there are quite a number of political refugees in Doncaster, and they don't always get an easy time. They have no money. They find it hard to get around. So they did this video. But the kind of kids that I'm talking about now, that's not enough for them. They said, we've got to do something more. We've got to help them have a better life. So this little clip will show you what they did.
Students, and it's more important for me because I spend good time and loving and sharing very cheerful moments and playing with the students and change my mood. They make my day.
We decided the best thing to do was to use the money we raised to buy as many bikes as we could for our new friends. We wanted to buy them something they could use every day that helps them connect with the community and get around without having to use any money. The money that was left over was given to the Conversation Club to help with their ongoing projects.
Our guys having bikes is a huge benefit for them because they want to socialise, they want to get about, and without a bike they have to walk basically, they can't afford to go on buses. So we always have a need to supply bikes, and it's very much welcome. Thank you very much, everybody.
Looking back over the exhibition, we have certainly learned a lot. We started in the classroom with an idea of what migration is and challenged ourselves to dig a little deeper. What we have found on our own doorstep was extraordinary, and getting it out into our community has made all the difference to our perspective. But as the exhibition comes to a close, what happens now? Of course, we'll keep in touch with our new friends. We'll continue to do our best to understand and support the community around us. But most importantly, we'll carry their stories and experiences with us for the rest of our lives. Because migrants are people, just like us, with families and hopes, with stories that deserve to be told.
I find that incredibly moving. I don't know how it affects you. And I wanted to share that with you today of all days, because it seems to me now that we are going to have Afghans. There are going to be lots of Afghan refugees who've had the most horrendous time getting here. There is amazing learning that can be done by thinking as a school or a college, what could you do for that community? I said the last time I spoke to a Sea Learning audience that I thought this pandemic offered an opportunity for schools and colleges to be at the heart of revitalizing communities, because they're going to need it, and start with these people, these refugees. See what you can do for them, and it will be learning that will stick with your students for the rest of their lives. I can guarantee it. So listen, I need to wrap up. User innovation. How are we going to get it? Well, we can only get users in control of their learning if we let go a bit of it ourselves. Not all of it, but just a bit of it. If we see that the purpose of learning is as much to build communities as it is to pass exams, and that we allow our institutions to be more porous, that people can come in and out. Look at Liger show that the 7 billion people, potential teachers, there are at your place too. And then finally, all three of those case studies have very, very simple structures, because that means that you can get complex learning. When you've got highly complex structures and highly complex curriculum designs, you tend to end up with fairly simplified, superficial learning. So that, I think, are the kind of keys to how to get user innovation within education. For me, people-powered innovation is about finding the people who can help make that place-based learning happen so that you can do work that matters. And I just think there is a moment now for all of us, and we can go back to normal, or we can try to seize that moment and say, how could we do something now for our communities, for the people who've got great stories to tell, who can really help us, but who we can also help. So that's it, really. I'll hand you back to Stephen and Jamie. I just think it's a potentially really exciting time. Okay, Stephen?
Yeah. Awesome as always, David. And we've had a lot of thoughts and comments and questions come in. I've written quite a few, but I'm going to leave it to the audience. I bet Jamie's written about 1 million. And what we'll do is we'll put it to the audience first, then we'll go to me. And if we've got any time, then Jamie can ask one question only. Only joking. Okay, so we had statistics 24. I'm guessing Neil King or somebody has asked this question, so I'm going to bring it up. Can culture change in an organisation be pushed through from workers, or does it have to come from those at the top? What have you seen, and have you seen instances of it?
Yeah, I have. Yesterday afternoon, I saw an organisation that frankly nearly went to the wall during COVID. A fantastic organisation doing niche garden furniture, but at a spectacularly high level. They nearly went to the wall because it was being driven by the leader, and he thankfully understood, and it just so happens he did happen to read The Power of Us at the time, but he understood that the only way he was going to get ownership was by letting his people bring ideas to the table. If he was, and I was that person, I was that leader, I'd come in, I'd have 1 million ideas before breakfast, and I'd try to get all my staff to kind of implement it. Pretty soon, they just kind of went, well, it's no point in having ideas because he's going to tell us what we're doing. So I don't think, Neil, it's about can it. I think it has to come from the bottom up, because when it's top down, it's just exhausting. And this guy's mental health that I was talking to yesterday, he shared that it was really suffering because he was trying to bear the weight of the world on his shoulders. Now he shares all the data around the organization, all the financial data. It's all open. And he is changing the culture. It's a long-term process. It's, as he said yesterday, it's at least 2 years, but it can happen. And I would argue it has to happen from the bottom up.
Love it. Yeah, I think autonomy, but also the whole expectation of staff and being clear with people, but also bringing them along on the journey. Like I said, innovation being driven by one person, you won't get the buy-in and you won't get the level of innovation, should we say, if it's from one person, because the power of diversity is so important.
Absolutely. And sorry, just to say one more thing on that. The agency that I talked about, we are based around that concept of getting change happen from the bottom up. That is, it flies in the face of all the kind of McKinsey, PricewaterhouseCoopers people. They say your job as a leader is to define the culture. I'm sorry, it's bollocks. You might have an idea of what that culture is in your head, but that isn't the culture. The culture is in the hearts and minds of the people who work in your organization. And they might think it's a very, very different culture, as James Watt from Brewdog found out recently. I'll say no more.
Exactly. What you think is happening and what you think should be the culture, unless everybody buys in or the majority buys in, then you've got compliant children, haven't you? You've got people nodding and saying yes, 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 or just been the worker drones, and we don't want that. So that's, great response there. Got one from our great friend Dave Leonard, suggesting regards to the whole thing around what do you want to do later in life question. It's often intended in regards to an insight, but how do we change that or rephrase that question? How do we pick an alternative, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in the book, I talk about let's stop talking about a job and let's start talking about occupation, because what occupies you it might be the thing that you get paid to do, but it might be the thing that you're doing down in the shed for a couple of hours every night. So I think this idea of what are you working on? You know, what are you feeling? What are you thinking these days? Is a much better way of finding out about people than what job do you do? Because that's basically what we say when we say what do you do? We're just saying, have you got a good job or not? As if that should define a person. So I like this idea of occupation as being, this is how I occupy my time. This is what means the most to me in my life. And I'd like us to start thinking about that.
Yeah, I think I saw some great examples of this in the work at Rob Hoban and Agora, and you have to. There are shackles within education, and I think it's probably the same across many countries and globally. But how you tackle that and how you think around potentially a barrier and come up with the solutions is so important, I think. Ian, then he's always going to be asking questions. So here's one for you. I'm only going to have him, let him have one. If he's got another one, he can stop asking questions. It's not coming up. So amazing schools. You've got all of this stuff. What do you think the main barriers are to change in the UK? But I'm going to say England in particular rather than the UK, because I think that Scotland and Wales are very, very different, and Ireland. What do you think the main barriers are to England then?
Well, I'm probably going to make myself really unpopular, but I do think that there's a degree of the Stockholm syndrome going on here, that for 30, 40 years, leaders in colleges and schools have been whacked over the head and told what to do. As a result, compliance has become the main driver. And so it's going to take a bit of courage to pop your head up above the parapet and say, is it going to get knocked off? But actually, the reality is that schools and college leaders have a lot more autonomy than they think they have, or they like to think they have. And in some cases, I'm not saying all, but in some cases, I meet some educators who it's just easier to go, I'd love to do all that, but they won't let us. And I kind of say, well, who's they? Who are you talking about now? Is it the government? Is it your middle manager? Is it your students? Because it's just too easy an excuse for not doing anything to say, I'd love to, but I can't. It's just not the case. We can do a lot more. I don't deny that there are some very real strictures and blockages which are in the way. And, even though we've had 2 years of what I consider to be a much better way of assessing students, I fear that we'll go back to the old system, timed written tests as the sole judge of what you can do. But I think there is still a lot more we can do in addition to the hoops that you have to jump through. We've just got to have a bit more courage.
Totally agree. Courage, be brave, take risks. Might not get it right, but pivot. And I think somebody once told me a story of how they responded to a question around, but how do you feel about taking risks with these young people's lives? And they responded to then say, actually, is it not a great risk what you're doing of not taking a risk and trying to evolve, because you're doing things based on a very outdated system, and some things are right, and some things not think about completely getting rid of exams, but just test is definitely not the approach. And there might be some kind of exam or endpoint assessment, but it doesn't have to be the be all and end all. This whole finite versus infinite game, doesn't it? So yeah, I'm just keen to get all the questions in before I throw it to Jamie. So Johnny Reagan, in regards to project and experimental learning activities, what do you think, if somebody's thinking about it, what's the first step forward of overcoming it, do you think?
Well, it's fascinating. I think that we've got, and you mentioned Wales, and I think what's interesting about Wales is they are moving much more towards a more experiential based system. I think unless they change the assessment system as well, it's kind of doomed to failure, because you're judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree. And so if we're going to shift the actual experiences that our students are getting, we also have to shift the way of assessing it. And people are doing this. I advise an organization called the Mastery Transcript Consortium, which is a global collection of schools around the world. And they have found ways to assess and validate all the things that, employers keep telling us that they need, like leadership skills and collaboration and creativity, communication skills being, one of the biggest, it seems to me, right now. So it's possible to do it, but our existing assessment systems don't allow for it. So I think right now, what a lot of us are forced into doing is to say, we can prepare you for the exam in a relatively short space of time. Let's do the really important stuff before that, or around it, alongside it. Because right now, the reality is we are stuck in a system. And so the Mastery Transcript Consortium did a very smart thing. It said, here's a different way of supplying a transcript for university. But don't get rid of the GPA. Just run it alongside. And pretty soon, and COVID showed that, because there was no GPA for a couple of years, so universities had to take the mastery transcript. And pretty soon, I think people will go, well, actually, this tells you a lot more about the student than I mean, Avi Schiffman, he's 1.7. That's his entire 12-year academic career, 1.7. What does that tell you? The guy bloody did a COVID tracking website. It's just, it's hopelessly inadequate for the task at hand.
Yeah, some great conversations, great comments. I'm not going to bring it up because I'm going to give Jamie an opportunity to ask his one question, but I've just seen it in terms of the fallacy of the exam, no exams this year, the fact that how we get to a teacher assessed grade that they just did mini tests and mini exams and all of this kind of thing. If the system is broken, we need to really start to create a revolution of the system and create that from grassroots and remove the unconscious bias of we know best. And are we asking students and everything else? And are we asking the whole stakeholder circle and group of stakeholders rather than just we are teachers or we are educators, we know better than you because you are much younger and what do you know? And it's not all, but I think there is that unconscious bias. Jamie, your one question, make sure it's a good one.
Yeah, I'm feeling the pressure now because you've only allowed me one question, which now I'm feeling like I should ask the ultimate question. Like, David, what is the answer to life, the universe? My question relates to, it's really about risk. And you mentioned it actually, Stephen, a few moments ago about how we perhaps have to look at how we treat risk slightly differently. Because if we're going to innovate and if we're going to experiment, which by definition requires managing uncertain outcomes and things, my question is really for David around what might be the best examples he's seen of how failure is treated in an organization. And what started me thinking about that question was how your book starts, chapter section 3, when you're talking about operating systems and the power of us, David, and you talk about the way your organization operates will either feed or starve the ability to innovate. And I think if you're afraid of failing or getting things wrong, that's one fast way to starve an organization. And I just wondered if you've got any examples on a positive sense of where you'd seen failure treated in an exemplary and inspirational way.
Yeah, well, the obvious one that springs to mind, not least because we recorded him telling the story, is Gary Ridge and WD-40. And the story of how WD-40 came about, I'll give you the shortened version. WD stands for Water Dispersal System, but the 40 represents the 39 previous attempts at the formula for the oil, which all failed. Now, in education, we wouldn't allow 39 failures. You'd never get to that point. You'd be told to give up. But they persevered. But what was ironic is that when Gary took over as CEO there, the people who worked there had become terrified of failure. Essentially, it only produced one thing. The organization did it brilliantly. Everybody's got a can of WD-40 under the sink. And the company was doing really well, but people were afraid to take risks. And so when it went wrong, they'd come in and say to Gary, I better tell you, I've just screwed up. And he'd say, no, you haven't. You've had a learning moment. So all I ask is that you share that learning moment. What is it that went wrong? And what have you learned as a result? Share it with everybody. And that way, we'll all have learned something. And I think that's a really great philosophy. We talk about this in education. We learn by failure. The reality is we do everything humanly possible to make sure that these young people don't fail. And there's another set of schools that people know I'm a big fan of, the high-tech high schools. And there was a film done largely about them. And at the end of it, there was a presentation of learning. And this student essentially had not met the deadline because he was a brilliant student, but because he actually wasn't able to kind of get all of his stuff together and work effectively with his team, they missed the deadline. He had to stand there in front of 700 people and explain why there was nothing to show. Now, some people will go, that's a humiliating experience. How dare you put a student through that? And it was your job, by the way, to make sure that it never happened because you should have kept them on task. And I had that very conversation with the teacher who was supervising that project. And he just said, yeah, I thought about all of that. And I thought, do I step in at this point? And then I thought, no, because it's a lesson that he will learn and he'll never put himself in that situation again. Ironically, now the student's now at the media school in New York, and he's going to be a film director, which like you have to be able to deliver on time. So he's learned his lesson, and that's the reality. If we keep preventing our students from being in a position where they might fail, they're just not going to learn.
So true. And what a great point to end on. The power of the collective and the power of us. Go check out the book if you haven't. I don't know where you've been. You must have been living under a rock. It seems like
there's been a pandemic on. People wanted escapism, Stephen. They didn't want some Geordie bloke talking about innovation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So buy the book, not the audio book, if you don't want to listen to a Geordie or anything else. But, yeah, it's.
Excuse me. The audio book is not added. He's fantastic. He talks proper. He's not like me.
Brilliant.
But no, what a pleasure as always. I think for us, our community that've been listening along, really appreciate you coming on, David. And let's carry on that. Let's look how we create a list so people don't think they're on their own. That whole thing around connective community and collaboration is key at every level, and whatever role, whatever organisation, that the power is with us and not with just the leaders. So we need to think about how we can change it if people above us are not going to do so. Let's get it going. Stephen Spencer asked a question about the golf course. Stephen, if you want to ask a question, I expect that you tweet it out, and we'll all discuss our favourite golf courses. But enjoy the rest of your day, everybody, and we'll speak to you soon. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.